Welcome to the Classroom Narratives Healing and Education podcast, the space where education meets resilience. I'm Dr. Joey Weisler, and in each episode, we dive deep into the personal stories of educators, students, leaders, and frontline advocates who are navigating the complexities within modern education. Whether you're just starting your teaching journey or are a seasoned professional looking for inspiration, we'll explore how to foster meaningful change, prevent burnout, and build trauma-informed communities within our schools. Now, let's take a seat at the front of the classroom as we get started. Welcome to the Classroom Narratives Healing and Education podcast. I'm Dr. Joey Weisler, and today's guest is someone whose presence in the field of trauma-informed care has shaped how schools and communities respond to crisis. Dr. Tom DeMaria is a clinical and school psychologist, a two-time recipient of the New York State Liberty Award, and a fellow in both the trauma and clinical divisions of the APA, which is the American Psychological Association. And Dr. DeMaria assists with coordination of the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement, otherwise known as the NCSCB, as a way to support grieving students and provide consultation to schools who are dealing with both crisis and loss. And from supporting families after 9/11 to working with communities in the wake of both Newtown and Parkland, that's Sandy Hook and Stoneman Douglas, Dr. DeMaria has spent his career helping us understand how to hold space for that grief and how to lead with both compassion and clarity. And I want to pause and mention, as I welcome Tom to the show, that I saw Tom speak on the panel at the 9/11 exhibit in February 2025, and that panel was called Through Their Eyes, Therapeutic Art for Grieving Children. And it was really a sensational experience to listen to, quite frankly, children who were older than me at 9/11 work alongside Tom and their colleagues to find their lives come back to them, just find their healing as a way to move forward from that tragedy, and the way that Tom and his colleagues were able to support them in doing so. And so with that being said, Tom, a very warm welcome to our show, and thank you again for joining me tonight.
Oh, you're welcome. And thank you for that nice introduction. I have to tape it for my mom. I'll send her a copy. I'm always happy to hear nice things about her son. She's 91 now. So that's a blessing in itself.
Absolutely. But we'll have her check it out here on the show as well. And so I have a couple of questions that I'm going to be asking Tom in terms of just responding to 9/11 and thinking about a tragedy that happened 24 years ago, and how that knowledge base has built us into just what we still see in the modern tragedy. Because again, we say that the past is practice, but what have we really learned in terms of just how we keep seeing the cycle of trauma repeat? And I'm hoping that Tom can be a voice with his testimony and showing what skills we can still provide to both people and also our schools in general, since we are the Classroom Narratives podcast that focuses here on education. So, Tom, the first thing I wanted to ask you was, what got you interested in the work that you do?
I was working at a hospital. I was the chief psychologist, and we had received a message that a plane had crashed in Cove Neck, the Avianca plane, many years ago. And at that point in time, there was really no formal structure to help support families and children. And what made the situation even more unique, a majority of people who were on that plane were not English speaking. So there had to be arrangements made to have translators come to the site. But then the question became, well, what do we do then? People were upset, people were very sad about what happened. So the question is, what do we do? So I think based on that tragedy, and the same thing after tragedies like 9/11, we learn more about what we need to know. And from there, I just pursued more and more education about trauma and understanding the impact of trauma on children and adults, families. And that eventually led me to realize that loss is oftentimes not considered when we deal with trauma. With every traumatic situation that happens, there's loss. Somebody's losing part of their life, maybe, or sometimes a sense of safety. But a lot of times it could be functioning, or it could be even the loss of a loved one. So it's broadened that concept. And I think in the trauma field, what I've seen a real growth in is a respect for the fact that number one, trauma does sadly create lasting impact on people. Certainly, we've seen that with people who are victims of crime or military veterans. But we're also seeing that trauma can occur fairly commonly in a lot of people, but also loss can occur pretty commonly too. We know that most children, by the time they turn 18, will have experienced a loss of a family member. So how does that corrupt child development? How does the loss of a mother, father, grandfather, et cetera, corrupt things? So I think my learning and the field, I think, has progressed in that way.
Thank you for sharing that. And as your work has progressed, you've been at the front lines of some of the most profound national tragedies, which have included 9/11, Newtown, and Parkland. And these moments have also involved, as you disclosed on our panel back at the 9/11 memorial in February, right? That there is often young children involved with loss in these instances. So I wanted to know if you could share with us a little bit more about some moments that have taught you through these tragedies about just how the emotional architecture of schools and children work and how grief can eventually just ripple throughout a community and what experts in the field like you can do to work through that and with that.
Yeah, and it's a really important point because I think it led me to rethink, and that's why I've become more involved with the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement, that a school psychologist, school social worker, somebody who's in guidance or a school counselor can't see every child in that building who is impacted by a loss. We need to educate teachers, administrators, bus drivers, school custodians, support staff to all be consistent in their message that loss is something that affects us all, and loss is complicated, but it's also simple. It's based on the bond we had with people. The greater the bond, the bigger sense of loss we have. And giving the teachers, educators an opportunity when grief happens to process it with children. Children are very different than adults. Adults can hold it into that 45-minute therapy session. Kids' emotions are more fluid. I remember when I was working with grieving children at the World Trade Center Family Center, I was playing with a bunch of children, and one little boy pulled out a mass card about his father and his funeral, and the other little boy pulled out one too, like they were holding baseball cards. And one boy said to the other boy, "I have one of those," and yeah, I have one too. And they looked at each other, and they shared that understanding that each other had lost their dads, and they put the cards back in their pocket and they kept playing. So I realized that's how grief works with children. Grief works in the middle of the night sometimes when the child can't go to sleep, and they need to have a caring caregiver there to provide support and safety to the child. Somebody they can trust will keep them safe. So you realize that we need to build that foundation in communities, and we needed to build that consistently. So in interventions that I've been on, our goal is not to come in there as outsiders and work with all the children. Our goal is to build the educators and people working who have contact with these children that they can be available, they can listen, they can make that first step to talk to a child. Oftentimes, and I've seen it in hundreds of school consultations, school staff don't want to hurt children. They're really supportive to children, so they don't say anything. I might offend them, but we find that sometimes gives the message to children that they can't talk about their feelings or what's bothering them. So we encourage schools to initiate the conversation. Say, listen, I heard your dad died. That's sad. If you ever want to talk about it, I'm here. Which in the past would have been, oh, can't bring it up. Lost their dad. Let's just keep an eye on them. Let's not bring it up at all. Or if they bring it up, send them right to the school counselor. That's not what a teacher should do. Rather, give teachers the comfort because they've also been there themselves. And they also have been through that experience that they can be supportive to children. Let them know it's okay. Grief can occur at any time, it can be triggered and activated, as can trauma. But give people the comfort that they can help in the schools and make the schools really a safe place for children. The other side of it, it's a 9/11 story too. I worked, as most people did, trying to provide support to the families or first responders. And I remember not being home for a while because I was busy at the hospital, busy at our family center, helping families. And one day my wife said, "You got to take a break." So about a couple of months after 9/11, we went apple picking out east in Long Island. And I was with my son, who was maybe 4 or 5 years old, and we were picking apples and felt this tugging on my shoulder. And I said, "What's going on?" And he says, "Dad, do we really need all these apples?" And I looked down and there was a wagon full of hundreds of apples that I had picked. I realized, okay, I was getting overloaded with compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma. And I realized back then, if I was going to keep doing this work, I had to take care of myself. I had to put my family and myself in the mix in terms of getting that support. And that helped me. I think it's helped me stay fresh for people, and it's helped me not dread the work of going into a crisis situation. You feel it. Being in our field, you have to be empathic and caring, but you also have to protect yourself too. So I realize you got to be there, but you got to not let the person you're trying to help you because they see you're burnt out or disconnecting in any way.
So, Tom, you just took me in a bunch of different directions that I'm so glad that you did because I wanted it to come from you and not from me. So I think that's awesome. Thank you for that. So I'll share a little story. And Tom, the way that you and I met face to face is because after the panel, well, let me back up. During the panel, it was a panel on 9/11 back in February, but Parkland came up as a response that you had made at that time. And instantly, I mean, you had already had my attention, but you really got me there because I'm from Parkland. I'm in Parkland. Our listeners are also from the area. They're my colleagues who were there and experienced that loss. So by hearing that, I knew you would be the perfect voice for this project. And the little story is that I was actually one of the first substitute teachers to be invited back into the building to Stoneman Douglas on March 14th, 28 days after the tragedy had happened. The school opened up on February 28th, and I came back on the 14th of March. And as I'm coming back, I'm sitting in the same classrooms as students who were in that 1200 building. And we didn't really have training. Like I saw some grief counseling before I went back, but especially as the substitute, I'm just a community member. Nobody really trained us how to actually talk with students and guide students. So we were actually encouraged to just brush it off and be quiet and let them go to the professionals, which actually looking back was not a terrible idea. But still by being there and letting students share their stories freely if they so wanted to, I did get a lot of vicarious trauma from that. And in the fall, I was working at their feeder middle school, which is also where I was the day of the shooting, where students from those classes had lost siblings, friends, had parents in that building. And I worked with those students as their interim part-time teacher that entire fall semester, 2018. So then the next spring comes along and I moved to another city, the same district, different city. And February comes along once again. Now it's 2019. And the administration says to us, there's one student that we know in this school a year later who is still struggling with the loss of a good friend from Parkland. If you know her, do not see her, do not talk to her, do not bring it up, just completely ignore it, just brush it off, which kind of goes back into what you mentioned, where it's very easy to have that kind of response. That student actually came to visit my classroom for an activity through another teacher. And I just noticed that there was a sign on her backpack that represented the loss of one of the people from the tragedy. And I happened to casually ask, hey, does that represent the loss of so-and-so? That's all I had to ask. That student looked at me and she said, you are just the person I need to talk to. Thank you for bringing that up. And she became my student that next year. And I felt like having those conversations with that student was a way for me to overcome my own vicarious trauma. But in a way, I also had to be very careful in a way that I was not inducing more trauma into that child. So the twofold question that I wanted to ask is, for our teachers that really struggle with addressing trauma, how can you work to take care of yourself as the educator and managing those traumas, and also approach students in a way that is trauma informed and not trauma induced?
Well, there's an important differentiation and that's that grief and trauma are mixed together. And
Yes.
oftentimes it's hard to separate them. Certainly the courage of both the students and staff at Marjory Stoneman Douglas still impresses me to this day. But what's difficult is when it's mixed together. And with trauma, when it's activated, you want to be able to manage the feelings and put it away. You want to be able to process it and put it away. With grief, when it's activated, you want to manage the feelings, but you want to remember the bond. And that's what's tricky because it's one size doesn't fit all. So the people who are in the school or had siblings in the school or were connected, we all have connection. It's the 6 degrees of separation issue. We all are
Yes.
connected. It's hard to disentangle the elements of what happened that's traumatic from that which involves a deep loss of a bond of a teacher, the brave teachers that were there. So how do you disentangle one with the other? So in approaching children, it's making sure that you initiate a conversation without necessarily activating the trauma, knowing that may be something the child does not want to happen. That's why it can be difficult. But oftentimes children are happy, in a sense, talking about their loss of the bond with the person that they lost. So that navigation could be a little tricky, but I find giving the child permission and asking them very innocent questions and not pushing them, letting the child know that invitation's there, can help them discern what they wanted. If the child that you approach said, I don't want to talk about it, that's cool. Then you just say, hey, I'm here if you do. That's it. And knowing when to back away is really important. And that's something that needs to be kept in mind. But oftentimes, I once had a child, and not at Parkland, but another district that we did, and I went back for a follow-up visit, and I had just said hi, and the child came up to me and said, can we talk? You seem like a good guy. And the only reason they came up is because I had just made myself available by saying hello. So oftentimes those connections are important. The other part of your question, though, is you're right. Being yourself, you get put into a tough situation. And what happens is that being empathic, we feel what other people feel, and we want to help. And it's hard to listen and to take a lot in. So we encourage people to know their limits and also to know what they're bringing into the situation. Oftentimes, people do have exposure to prior trauma, either through their work experience. Sometimes it could be a death by suicide. Sometimes it could be violence that they may have seen, a car accident, whatever. Know what you're bringing in, know what your limitations are, and know when, after you've had a lot of compassion fatigue, after listening to students, know how you best can handle it. For some people, it's exercising, spending time with family, distracting themselves. For other people, it's sharing with a colleague and just saying, wow, can we talk? That was rough. Or a family member. So knowing your limits and knowing when you do have it that you need not to go pick apples, you need to be able to find somebody that you can talk to and process a lot of that stuff. It goes back to the whole theory of therapy. A lot of therapy is by talking through, we get insight, because just by thinking it in our own head, it doesn't really resolve issues. But talking to another person could be magical in a lot of ways. But not everybody wants to do that, and that's okay. But school staff need to realize that that's something that's very important. And you can't mandate people to share because that's not the way they handle it. But giving them the opportunity is very important.
But talk therapy that invites but doesn't mandate other people to participate in that dialogue.
Children will oftentimes, if they're carrying a burden, won't tell everybody. They'll oftentimes find the one person that they feel they can connect with in some way. So it can be felt like a burden, but there's also something called compassion satisfaction. Knowing a child like the child who came to you to talk, trusted you or saw something in you that they could share, is what an honor that is. And that's something that's really important, that you find satisfaction in the fact that you helped that child on a pathway. You don't need to be their therapist and you don't need to be anywhere, but they reached out to you. You opened the door for that child. That's just a wonderful feeling. And we talked about compassion fatigue, but compassion satisfaction is a very important part of it.
I would believe that I would be speaking for many different kinds of educators who continue to struggle with bringing that baggage home at night from what they've experienced in the day in their classrooms. And to those educators who are listening, I applaud you, and I hope that Dr. DeMaria is here to give you the tools that you need to move forward from that headspace. And Tommy, you have a great point that teachers are not therapists, but I think all it takes to acknowledge a child is just by being a good person and a good listener. And students have very good intuition. And when they know that they have someone that they can address that with, they're very likely to be honest and open with us. And I think about that a lot when I think back to teachers that I've enjoyed the most. And when I look at my own end of the semester evaluations at the schools I teach at, students will more than likely say, we like him because he cared.
And they pick up and they pick it up. It's amazing. Oftentimes with people I've worked with, children, I'll go, I have to tell you something. Oh, it looks like you're going on vacation. I said, it didn't say anything. It looks like you can tell it on your face. It's amazing how being open and honest with children is really important, and sincerity and caring is really important. And that's why I think we need to do our own homework after a tragedy occurs. If we're mourning a loss, it's going to be hard for us to ask about loss. but not impossible. It just means we have to be open that we might have feelings stirred up too when talking to a child. Children, especially children who go through tragedies, stir up so much strong emotions. And I think we just have to be aware that's may happen, and we need to make sure that we have our place to go to make sure those feelings are processed.
Absolutely. And that leads me to my next question, because again, you have responded to many different types of disasters in educational settings. And I wanted to think about, what have you learned from Newtown to Parkland based on 9/11? And I guess what I'm wondering here is if you could share, how has your knowledge base developed from tragedy to tragedy in terms of things that have worked, things that have been consistent, things that you adjusted in between, and what that's done for you as an expert in this time?
What always impressed me is the courage of children and the dedication of school staff. I think it's just so impressive that even after the most horrific things, children want to go back to school. They wanted to support their peers, and helping them believe that is a strength that they can always tap into, while acknowledging, though, that sometimes thoughts and feelings can linger a little bit. And so it's helping people, it's commending strength, but letting people know that they still have to make sure that there's nothing kicking around. Not treating everybody who goes through a trauma as needing trauma treatment, but letting them know what post-traumatic stress is, letting them know what grief is, giving those tools, and letting them know the door is open. It's an empowerment model. I've learned that as much as I'd love to do therapy with everybody when I go to a tragedy, it's empowering them with information, empowering the staff in a school, that the magic is in their hands and they can do that work. And certainly you want to have screening available for children who show more serious signs that they may need support, they're self-destructive or violent or whatever. But most children need that encouragement to help others, to help their peers, and most staff realize that they have the power also. It's an amazing thing to do empowerment work and not wait till it becomes something that you have to do an intervention for. After 9/11, we set up the 9/11 Family Center. I think we worked with several thousand family members who lost people on 9/11. And I remember being asked, are you doing assessments on everybody who comes in? I said, what do you mean? Well, have you done full assessments on all the children and adults? It was a mental health model, which is certainly important. And I said, well, if the children are showing signs, then we would do that. But we're community-based. We're trying to build a healing community, a community based on trauma theory, grief theory that can help. But we want a center that can help people feel empowered enough to help themselves. I think oftentimes when people feel that they're just the recipient of services and not fully participating, they don't feel that sense of control they need and agency in their lives. And that I've picked up in the field. It's about giving people agency to find the way and to really help themselves.
I love that response, because it helps me ask my next question, which is how many schools today are still continuing to struggle and address grief in real time. Like if there's a loss by suicide in the community, or by the time that we're recording this on April 23rd, our listeners will hear this in May or even over the summer. But at the time of this recording, there was a shooting at Florida State University in Tallahassee over the weekend, where actually many freshmen who were in that building at Stillman Douglas are about to graduate from that same college or university in next month in May. So that freshman, 8 years later, they now have a second tragedy. And in addressing these types of griefs and traumas in real time, again, whether it's student loss, national tragedies, or even just collective burnout and exhaustion, especially in today's climate, what are some of the core principles that schools can follow as a blueprint to handle those responses?
Well, the first thing is that I think every school needs to become trauma informed and grief sensitive. All staff have to have that working knowledge. The coaches, the school bus driver, the person in the cafeteria, you don't know who the child or adolescent's going to gravitate to, but letting them know at least about what can be expected in terms of what they've been through, I think is essential. Because again, giving them that knowledge, a lot of children and adolescents who start having hyperventilation after being exposed to a grief or trauma activator may think they're crazy or may think they're going crazy. And they don't understand that it traces back to this loss of feelings of safety. Bad dreams you had, the sleep difficulties might be because you had a dream about dad or mom or your classmate who died. Understanding mental health issues. For example, after a death by suicide, in the past, people would just not talk about it, but Now we need to talk about mental health issues that affect people, that lead to death by suicides and depression awareness, mental health awareness. So it's education before the event, because training during an event when people can't learn because they're so preoccupied with a lot of different things is really hard. So we encourage getting the training done beforehand to understand these basic principles and concepts. Not everybody has to be an expert, but enough to understand what trauma is and what it's not, and what grief is and what's not. And we talked before about the difference between you want to remember the person you died, but you don't remember how they died. It's a big difference. And understanding that subtlety is really very important. And sadly, because of staff turnover and student turnover, the collective knowledge in schools changes. We would think, and sometimes we go in and do a training and the school feels really good and they have all that knowledge, but people leave, people retire, people transfer, people go schools, the children you mentioned leave, and that collective knowledge is lost. So it's the vigilance to know we have to keep training and retraining and retraining. And that's so very important. And the other thing to appreciate is that we can't protect our children from all the harmful things that can happen to them. Sadly, I wish we could, but it's not possible. And sadly, school shootings or acts of violence, hatred, prejudice, things happen. And we want to work as a culture to minimize them, but helping children know when these things happen, what the personal impact on them and how they can develop tools and skills to deal with them in the future can be very important. And that's why hopefully children won't experience traumatic events in schools, but if they do, well, then how can they cope with it? And how can that make them more resilient and able to face other things that they may face in the future? Putting things away, not dealing with it, we've learned doesn't help build resilient children and cultures. So we need to help children realize that you fall, you skin your knee, you put your Band-Aid on, but then you figure out why you fell and how to get the Band-Aid and how to dress your own wound. It's an important principle that I think we need to give our children and give them that courage for the future.
Definitely. And one of the strategies that I take in my own courses that I instruct as well through St. John's University. I know Tommy did some coursework there as well. So go Johnnies.
That's my alma mater. That's
Yes.
my bachelor. Yeah.
And the work that I do there as well in my dissertation through their program is all about taking trauma-informed approaches into the classroom and forming literature that can help us create a toolkit for just handling events in our lives. And most of the time it's well received, but every now and again, a student will say, hey, that's a little bit triggering for me. And I want to think about what are some ways that teachers can address traumatic events in their classrooms, or rather even in front of children, that can help them, again, become trauma-informed and not trauma triggering. What are some strategies you can offer teachers that are talking about history with trauma?
An important factor is if you want to believe in the pyramid of how people process events, and cognitive processing therapy talks about this. They talk about at the base is feeling safe and feeling safe in your environment, not just from violence, but being safe that other people will try to protect you and not expose you to things that you're not really prepared for. If that happens, you begin to trust the people that make you feel safe, and you begin to let go of control to them because you trust them and you feel safe. If you don't feel safe, you don't trust other people, and ultimately you don't want to give up control, so you become isolated in the sense in terms of feeling it's you versus the world. So in a classroom, if you expose a child to something that they're not ready for, you're taking away their sense of safety and trust in you, and they're going to want to seize control back from you by not participating or by being oppositional or whatever other form of protest they have.
Right.
So if you're going to introduce traumatic information, the student has to feel prepared and that there is a safety process. We're going to talk about this topic, and it's going to be next week. If there's a reason you feel uncomfortable about that, please talk to me and we can maybe give an alternative lesson. But if you can face it before we even get there, let's talk about how people handle when trauma is activated, traumatic memories are activated. And same thing with grief and loss. We'll be dealing with, in literature, a death of somebody. And that doesn't happen oftentimes. Oftentimes they're assigned a book and they find out, like for what's up, Mice and Men, there was a person.
That's our prime one. Yep, that's the first one we read. Yep.
And to tell them this is going to be about suicide, and this is about, so that's going to be in the book. But before we get to that part and you get to read that book, let's talk about how you cope with feelings, strong feelings that might get activated or feelings from your past. You don't have to be necessarily like yourself, a psychologist, to to help them get through a therapy session with a class, but you need to help them be prepared for what it is and how they cope. It might be to talk to a friend, it might be to do some exercise, it might be to tap into whatever spiritual belief systems they believe into. So I'd recommend coping first at a light level, even just breathing exercises, or it's a way to feel that they're okay. Informing them that there's a purpose for this. It's not just to shock them and overwhelm them. And telling them that they're going to be facing things at a small level and they don't have to worry about being exposed and things. And I think that helps. This whole process, I think, helps people get more used to talking more clearly about traumatic events and grief. Just a point that I find, though, that I've learned too, people today use trauma it's used to describe stressful situations. Like I hear from students, oh, I had a test tomorrow, I was traumatized. So I said, did the teacher try to kill you? Did the teacher take away your life? No, it was just stressful. It's stress. Trauma is traumatic stress, but it's stress caused by trauma versus stress caused by unrealistic demands, not feeling prepared. Something happens suddenly. So part of the clarification, I always say, make sure you don't overuse the trauma word. And that's why trauma-informed practices use things like the adverse experiences scale to help educate. These are what are considered to be adverse experiences, but not everybody who has an adverse experiences gets PTSD. They might have traumatic memories, and they might have symptoms that don't form the syndrome of post-traumatic stress disorder. But understanding that trauma is different than stress, but it is a form of stress. That's why I do a lot of, when I do training, and so I always talk about traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress versus stress, because people confuse it all the time.
You mentioned a little bit about trigger warnings as well, and I wanted to see if you could just briefly elaborate a little bit deeper as to just forming that connection between presenting information in a way that is welcoming, but not enabling the teacher to have to be that therapist, like drawing the boundaries between the facilitator and the therapist when trauma comes up in the classroom.
Yeah, what I would recommend is that you can't tell what will activate a person. You can't really, it could be a detail, it could be identification with a story, it could be a lot of things. You can't not activate because you're not in control. And students won't know what activates them too. But letting them know that the story contains themes of violence, interpersonal violence, which is typically associated with traumatic stress, or it contains themes of a loss of a family member. And those type of things can sometimes activate memories, feelings that may make us feel comfortable. But just to let you know, that will be part of it. And again, if you feel that being part of that lecture or lesson is going to be too hard for whatever personal reasons, you don't have to share, just talk to me and we'll figure out an alternative. It's that languaging that's really important. You can't not activate people. Now, obviously, showing scenes of carnage or things that are horrific, yeah, but if it's not that, it's kind of hard not to step on toes sometimes. The other thing we know about exposure is visual is much more impacting because it's much more, it's like a projected test. You project so much into it, violent images, versus verbal. Talking through a violent situation has a little different feel to it in terms of what can activate the children or students more. So sometimes saying, well, we're going to talk about 9/11 and what happened, but we're not going to show pictures of the planes crashing into the towers or people fleeing with blood on them. We're just going to talk about that event as an event, but we're not going to show images. So there's ways of softening a little bit, but giving people the control and permission to leave the situation if they need to. Again, I brought it up before. With trauma, you want to deal with the emotions, process it, but then put it away. With grief, though, you want to process it, but feel that bond that's there should be something you want to remember. You want to remember your parent who died. You don't remember the car accident. So it's understanding that difference, and especially with big events, the people sadly who die in a shooting, you want to remember their lives and what they meant and how they connected with you. You don't remember that they were shot and how they died and where they were at the time. And I think that's oftentimes how grief and trauma get confused.
Absolutely. Thank you for that point. And I have one more question before we come into our end here. And my question here is just speaking about the work that you've done with the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement, or the NCSCB. Could you share with us some of the tools and frameworks that these initiatives have been a part of you as an expert and what other schools should know about their work as well?
Sure. The National Center provides free consultations throughout the country and even internationally after there's an episode of school crisis or disaster, including death by suicide, school violence, hurricanes. Currently, we're doing a lot of work in Los Angeles after the wildfire through Children's Hospital of Los Angeles, where Dr. David Schoenfeld, who is the director of the center, is located. But we provide consultation to leadership. We provide training for mental health staff to help them deal with the situation, which can be overwhelming in any locality. So usually we work behind the scenes. If you can name a national crisis, we've been there in some one way or another. We only share where we've been when we have permission from the places. So I can't really talk about all the places we go to unless we have that permission. But the National Center provides that consultation via the phone, usually immediately. We have resources available on the site about notification, how schools can help prepare families. There's downloadable PowerPoint presentations, all free. So we provide that consultation resource, and we also let people know about best practices. Linked to the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement is the Coalition to Support Grieving Students, and that's a group that was created about 10 years ago to help empower schools. And there's modules, videos, handouts geared for people who work in schools. And the purpose is to give schools that empowerment. So teachers can download a module on what to say to children. You can download a module about should you let the kids go to funerals. You can download a module on how to help people of different cultures in your classroom. So what was amazing about the Coalition to Support Grieving Students, all major unions and organizations supporting schools endorse the content and are part of the coalition. So the superintendents, principals, teachers, psychologists, social workers, guidance counselors, nurses, I probably forgot somebody, have all endorsed the content. So they all agreed on it. And to date, we have well over 150 organizations in the country that all support this content curriculum. So that's great news here. We're very proud of it.
Excellent. Thank you for that as well. Did you have any closing thoughts for our listeners? Things we wanted to talk about today, but didn't just yet?
Yeah, I appreciate this opportunity, and it's exciting to me to have people out there still want to learn about trauma and loss and really see how ubiquitous it is in our culture and our world, and be willing to push their knowledge base a little bit and realizing that it's, ordinary magic is resilience, as it's been talked about, but working with trauma and loss, it doesn't have to seem so daunting. It could be something that we all kind of face into and feel comfortable with, whether you're an educator or a mental health professional.
Thank you so much for that. And where can listeners go to learn more about your work?
I would encourage them to go to the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. The website there has an email if they need to contact me, or there's a phone number if they need to have a consultation, all free of charge and anonymous. And the Coalition to Support Grieving Students is another free website. We receive a lot of our support through the New York Life Foundation, and there's books that could be downloaded too through that. But those are two great resources.
Thank you for that. So Dr. DeMaria is here to remind us that, again, healing is not a destination, but rather it is a practice. And there's one rooted that is in listening, holding space, and choosing to be present for those around us. So whether we're teaching in the aftermath of crisis or just building communities as a way to proactively prevent harm, Dr. DeMaria is here to remind us that there is both clarity and care in the practices we choose to engage with. So Tom, thank you again so much for being here with our listeners. Thank you for joining us on the Classroom Narratives Healing and Education podcast. If today's episode inspired you or made you think differently, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment or review wherever you listen to podcasts and stay connected with us on the @Classroom Narratives podcast over Instagram and Facebook. Remember, together we can transform our scars into stars in education, one conversation at a time.